The eternal axiom had been drifting for 18 cycles when the distress call finally reached Relay Station Gamma 7. The message was short and precise, as all communications were. The ship's quantum fold drive had failed. All diagnostic systems reported nominal function. The vessel could not move. Assistance was required. Admitting they needed help was almost worse than dying in the cold darkness between stars. There were beings of crystalline logic. Their bodies were tall and thin, with skin that shimmered like polished metal under bright light. Their eyes held no pupils, just swirling patterns of blue and silver that shifted when they processed information. They had built empires on mathematics. They had mapped the quantum structure of reality itself. Their ships were considered the finest in the known galaxy, engineered to tolerances so precise that other species could barely comprehend them. And yet the eternal axiom sat dead in space, its engines silent, its crew unable to explain why. The Galactic Council sent 3 engineering teams over the following cycles. Each team ran the same diagnostics. Each team found the same result. All systems were functioning within acceptable parameters. The quantum fold drive showed no errors. The power systems were stable. The navigation arrays were aligned. Everything was perfect. The ship simply refused to move. After the third team departed in confusion, the Council made a decision that would later be discussed in whispers across 100 space stations. They contracted a human. Was 47 years old. He had been working as a mechanic on cargo freighters since he was 19. He had no formal education in quantum mechanics. He had never seen a ship up close. His qualifications, according to the official records, consisted of extensive practical experience with propulsion systems and availability within the required. The truth was simpler. No engineer would take the job. The ship had already been examined by their best minds. To send another would be to admit that science had failed. So they found someone expendable, someone whose failure would reflect only on the primitive species he represented. Arrived at the eternal axiom aboard a small transport shuttle. He carried a single bag of tools and wore a patched jumpsuit that had seen better days. When the airlock opened and he stepped onto the vessel, the first thing he noticed was how clean everything was. The corridors gleamed. The air smelled like nothing at all. Every surface was smooth and perfect, without a single scratch or mark to suggest the ship had ever been used. Ship Coordinator N met him at the airlock. N was young by standards, barely 200 cycles old. The silver patterns in her eyes moved more quickly than those of older, suggesting a mind still eager to process new information. "You are the human consultant," she said. It was not a question. He replied, extending his hand. N looked at it for a moment, then touched her fingers to his palm in what assumed was the equivalent of a handshake. "The science cast is expecting you in the primary engine bay. I will escort you." They walked through corridors that curved in ways found slightly disorienting. The ship had been designed according to spatial logic, which apparently did not include right angles. Crew members passed them occasionally, their metallic eyes sliding over with expressions he could not read. None of them spoke to him. The primary engine bay was enormous, had worked on big ships before, but the eternal axiom was something else entirely. The quantum fold drive dominated the center of the chamber, a massive structure of interlocking rings and crystalline matrices that hummed with contained energy. Panels covered every wall, each one displaying streams of data in script that could not understand. 3 members of the science cast waited for him. Their robes were white, their postures rigid, and their expressions made it clear that they considered his presence an insult. "I am Arch-Scientist Aura," said the tallest of them. "I oversee the technical operations of this vessel. You have been granted access to our engine systems for the purpose of consultation. You will not touch anything without permission. You will not interfere with any ongoing diagnostics. You will report any observations to me directly. Is this understood?" Nodded. "Understood. Can you tell me what's wrong with the drive?" Aura's eyes swirled faster. If we knew what was wrong, we would not require your consultation. All diagnostics indicate perfect function. The drive simply does not engage. When did it stop working? 18 cycles ago. The ship completed a standard fold jump and arrived at the designated coordinates. When we attempted to initiate the next jump, the drive failed to respond. There was no warning, no indication of malfunction. It simply ceased to function. Looked at the massive drive system, and you've checked everything. We have run 947 diagnostic protocols. We have examined every component to the molecular level. We have simulated the drive's operation over 1 million times. Every simulation indicates that the drive should function perfectly. Aura's voice carried a note of frustration that suspected was rare for it to display. The mathematics are flawless. The engineering is flawless. There is no logical explanation for the failure. Set down his tool bag. Mind if I take a look around? Aura gestured dismissively. You may observe. I doubt you will find anything our instruments have missed. Started walking. He moved slowly around the drive system, not looking at the data panels or the diagnostic readouts. Instead, he looked at the physical structure itself. He examined the joints where components connected. He studied the surfaces of the crystalline matrices. He got down on his knees and looked at the underside of conduits that ran beneath the main assembly. They watched him with expressions that ranged from confusion to contempt. After 20 minutes, stopped near a section of piping that ran from the drive's cooling system. He crouched down and placed his hand flat against the metal surface. He held it there for a long moment, then moved his hand to a different spot, then another. "What are you doing?" Aura demanded. "Feeling the temperature differential," said. "This section here is about 2 degrees warmer than the sections on either side." "Impossible. The thermal sensors indicate uniform temperature distribution throughout the cooling system." Shrugged. "Your sensors might be right, but my hand says different." He leaned closer to the pipe, then pressed his ear against it. They exchanged glances that clearly questioned his sanity. "I can hear something," said. "A high-pitched whine, very faint. You probably can't hear it without equipment." "Our acoustic sensors have detected no anomalous sounds." "Might be outside their range." Pulled a small flashlight from his pocket and shone it along the length of the pipe. He moved slowly, examining every inch of the surface. Then he stopped. "There," he said, pointing at a spot that looked identical to every other spot on the pipe. "You see that?" Aura leaned in, her silver eyes scanning the area indicated. "I see nothing." "Look at the color, right there where the pipe connects to the manifold. It's slightly different, just a shade darker than the rest." "That is not possible. These components are manufactured to identical specifications. There can be no color variation." Pulled out a small tool and gently scraped the surface of the pipe. A thin layer of residue came away on the edge. "That's oxidation," he said. "You've got a leak." The science guest was silent for a moment. Then Aura spoke, her voice cold. "There is no leak. Our pressure sensors would have detected any loss of coolant. It's not a big leak, probably just a hairline fracture in the manifold joint. The coolant is escaping as vapor, and your sensors are reading the overall pressure as stable because the loss is so gradual." Stood up and wiped his hands on his jumpsuit. "But over 18 cycles, enough coolant has leaked out that the drive can't maintain the temperatures it needs for the fold process. Your diagnostics say everything is fine because they're measuring the wrong things." Aura's eyes swirled rapidly. "Our diagnostic systems were designed by the finest scientific minds in the collective. They account for every possible variable." "Every variable you thought of," said. "But you built this ship to be perfect. You never programmed your systems to look for imperfections. The manifold cannot fail. Our calculations indicate it has a functional of 3,000 cycles minimum." "Calculations are one thing. Reality is another." Reached into his tool bag and pulled out a small welding torch. I can fix this in about an hour if you let me. Or you can run another 900 diagnostic protocols and keep drifting." Aura stared at him for a long moment. The other members of the science cast murmured to each other in rapid. Finally, Aura stepped back. "Proceed, but if you damage our systems, you will be held responsible." Nodded and got to work. N watched from a distance as the human mechanic began dismantling a section of pipe that every instrument said was functioning perfectly. She had been raised to believe that mathematics was truth, that logic was the only reliable path to understanding. But she had also watched 3 engineering teams fail to solve a problem that this human had identified in less than an hour. She did not understand how he had done it, and that uncertainty, more than anything else, made her want to learn. Worked through what they called the rest cycle. Most of the science cast had returned to their quarters, unwilling to watch a human disassemble components they considered sacred. Only N remained, standing at a respectful distance while removed the faulty manifold joint. The fracture was so small that it was barely visible even when he held the component under direct light. A thin line, no wider than a human hair, running along the inner surface where the joint connected to the main coolant line. Coolant had been escaping as a fine mist, so gradual that the pressure sensors registered no change. "How did you know?" N asked. Looked up from his work. "Know what?" "That the fault was there. You had no instruments. You ran no calculations. You simply walked around the engine and found it." Thought about the question for a moment. He was not used to explaining his process. Most people he worked with either understood it already or did not care. "Experience," he said finally. "I've been fixing things for almost 30 years. After a while, you start to notice patterns. The way things look when they're about to break, the way they sound, the way they feel. But how can you trust such observations? They are not quantifiable. They cannot be through mathematical analysis. They get every time I fix something." Held up the fractured manifold joint. "This is verification enough for me." N processed this information. It conflicted with everything she had been taught about proper methodology. Science was built on the principle that knowledge must be objective, measurable, and reproducible. What described was none of those things. And yet it had worked. "The science cast will not accept your explanation," she said. "They will say the fault was random, an anomaly that could not have been predicted." "They can say whatever they want. Doesn't change what happened." Returned to his work, carefully fitting a replacement joint he had fabricated from materials in his tool bag. The replacement was not as elegant as the original component, but it would hold. He had built things from worse. "May I ask you something else?" N said. "Go ahead." "On your world, do all humans possess this ability, this pattern recognition you describe?" Smiled. "Most people have it to some degree. Humans are good at noticing when something's off. We evolved that way. If you couldn't tell when a predator was hiding in the tall grass, you didn't live long enough to have kids. So it is a survival mechanism. I guess you could call it that. We don't think about it much. It's just how our brains work. We see things, we hear things, we feel things, and our minds put the pieces together before we even realize we're doing it." N considered this. They had evolved differently. Their world had been stable, predictable, governed by mathematical constants that could be calculated and trusted. They had never needed to develop the kind of rapid, intuitive threat assessment that humans took for granted. "It seems inefficient," she said, "to rely on such imprecise processes." "Maybe, but it works." Finished fitting the new joint and began welding it into place. "Your people built some of the most advanced ships in the galaxy. You've mapped the quantum structure of space itself. But when something goes wrong in a way your models didn't predict, you're stuck. Humans aren't as smart as, we can't do the calculations you do, but we're adaptable. We're good at dealing with things we don't fully understand." The welding torch hissed as sealed the final connection. He stepped back and examined his work. It was not pretty by standards, but it was solid. "That should do it," he said. "Want to help me run a pressure test?" N moved to the diagnostic panel and entered commands. She watched as the system registered the new component and began circulating coolant through the repaired line. The pressure held steady. "No leakage detected," she reported. "The repair appears to be successful." Nodded. "Let's see if the drive will start up now." They walked together to the main control interface. Had no idea how to operate systems, so he stepped back and let N handle the technical aspects. She entered a sequence of commands that made the crystalline matrices begin to glow with soft blue light. The quantum fold drive hummed to life. It was a sound that the crew of the Eternal Axiom had not heard in 18 cycles. It resonated through the deck plates, a deep vibration that felt in his bones. The massive ring structures began to rotate slowly, building up the energy required for fold space travel. N stared at the readouts, her silver eyes swirling faster than had ever seen them. All systems are nominal. The drive is functioning within expected parameters. Guess that settles it then. The doors to the engine bay opened, and Aura strode in with several other members of the science cast. They had clearly been monitoring the situation from elsewhere on the ship. Aura's expression was difficult to read, but thought he detected something that might have been frustration mixed with reluctant acknowledgement. "The drive is operational," Aura said. "It was not a question." "Yes," N replied. "The human's repair was successful." Aura turned to, "Explain your methodology. How did you identify the fault?" Wiped his hands on a rag. "I looked at the pipes until I found something that didn't look right. Then I checked to see if I was correct." "That is not a methodology. That is guessing." "Call it what you want. The ship moves now." Aura was silent for a moment. The other members of the science cast watched the exchange with expressions that ranged from hostility to curiosity. "Our diagnostic systems should have detected the coolant leak," Aura said finally. "The fact that they did not indicates a flaw in our sensor calibration. We will need to recalibrate all systems and run new diagnostic protocols. Or you could just have someone walk around and look at things once in a while," suggested. "Sometimes the simple approach works best." Aura did not respond to that. Instead, she turned to one of her colleagues. "Prepare a report for the Galactic Council. The Eternal Axiom will be returning to active service." As the science cast filed out of the engine bay, N remained behind. She watched gather his tools and pack them back into his bag. "You will be leaving soon," she said. "Once my shuttle is refueled. Got another job waiting at Station 12. I would like to understand what you did, the process you used. I know the science cast dismisses it, but I believe there is something valuable in your approach, something we have overlooked." Zipped up his bag and looked at the young. Her eyes were still swirling quickly, processing, analyzing, trying to make sense of something that did not fit her existing models. "You want to know how humans think?" he asked. "Yes, I want to understand." Considered the question. It was not something he had ever tried to explain before. Most people either understood intuition naturally or they did not. Teaching it seemed impossible. But N was genuinely curious. That counted for something. "Tell you what," he said. "I've got some time before my shuttle leaves. Walk with me through the ship. I'll show you what I look for. Can't promise it'll make sense to you, but I'll try." N nodded. "I would appreciate that." They left the engine bay together, the human mechanic and the young coordinator, walking through corridors that gleamed with impossible perfection, pointed out things as they went. A panel that was slightly misaligned, a light fixture that flickered so briefly most people would never notice, a door that made a faint grinding sound when it opened. None of these things were failures by standards. They were within acceptable tolerances, but they were signs of wear, indicators that entropy was at work even in the most carefully designed systems. "You see this?" said, pointing at a section of wall plating. "The surface is slightly duller here than the sections around it. That means people touch this spot a lot. Maybe there's a maintenance access panel behind it, and technicians brace themselves here when they're working. Over time, the oils from their skin break down the finish." "Our sensors do not monitor such things," N said. "They are considered irrelevant to ship function." "Maybe they are, but they tell you things. They tell you how the ship is used, where the stress points are, where problems might develop before your sensors pick them up." They continued walking, talked about the ships he had worked on over the years, the problems he had solved, the lessons he had learned. He talked about his father's tractor back on Earth, how he had taken it apart when he was 12 years old just to see how it worked. He talked about the cargo freighters that were held together with welded patches and stubborn hope, vessels that should have been scrapped decades ago but kept flying because someone knew how to listen to their complaints. N listened to everything. She asked questions. She took notes on a small device she carried, and slowly something began to shift in her understanding. They had built their civilization on the assumption that the universe could be fully described by mathematics. Every phenomenon had an equation. Every problem had a solution that could be calculated. This approach had served them well for thousands of cycles, but was showing her something different. He was showing her that some knowledge could not be calculated. It had to be felt. It had to be accumulated through years of experience, stored in the neurons and muscle memory of a living being, accessed through processes that could not be or reproduced. It was inefficient. It was imprecise. It was fundamentally incompatible with scientific methodology. And it had saved the eternal axiom. When they reached the airlock where shuttle was docked, N stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for showing me these things. I do not fully understand them yet, but I believe I have learned something important." Smiled, "Keep looking at things, not just with instruments, with your own eyes, your own hands. Trust what they tell you even when the data says different." That is very difficult advice for it to follow. "I know, but you're young. You've got time to learn." He extended his hand again, and this time N took it more naturally, her fingers wrapping around his palm in a gesture that felt almost human. "Safe travels. Take care of yourself, N, and take care of this ship. She's got a lot of life left in her, even if your calculations say otherwise." He stepped through the airlock, and the door closed behind him. A few minutes later, N felt the slight vibration as the shuttle undocked and moved away from the eternal axiom. She stood at the airlock window and watched the small vessel grow smaller until it was just a point of light among the stars. Then she turned and walked back into the ship, her mind churning with new ideas, new questions, new possibilities. The science cast would continue to believe that success had been luck, an anomaly, an embarrassing exception that proved nothing about the inferiority of human cognition. But N knew better. She had watched him work, she had listened to him explain, and she had begun to understand something that her people had missed for thousands of cycles. Intelligence was not just about processing speed. It was not just about mathematical precision. It was about connection, about understanding the physical reality of things, not just their abstract representation. Humans had evolved in a world of predators and prey, of weather and seasons, of tools and materials. They had learned to survive by paying attention to the world around them in ways that went beyond conscious analysis. They had evolved in a world of stability and calculation. They had learned to thrive by building models and trusting the mathematics. Both approaches had value. Both had limitations. But when the eternal axiom had been drifting dead in space, it was not the models that saved it. It was a human with a flashlight and a welding torch. N made a decision. She would request transfer to a station where she could work with humans more closely. She would study their methods, their intuitions, their strange and beautiful way of understanding the world. She did not know if she could ever truly learn to think the way did, but she was determined to try. Because the universe, she was beginning to realize, was bigger than any model could capture, and sometimes the only way to understand it was to reach out and touch it. The official report filed by arch-scientist Aura was 11,000 words long. It detailed the diagnostic procedures that had been performed, the sensor that would be implemented, and the theoretical framework that had been developed to explain the manifold failure. It mentioned the human consultant in a single sentence, describing his contribution as auxiliary mechanical assistance. The report was read by 17 members of the Galactic Council's Scientific Oversight Committee. None of them found it remarkable. But the crews talked. On space stations and cargo vessels, in repair bays and engineering decks, the story spread. A ship, dead in space, 3 engineering teams unable to find the problem, and a human mechanic who fixed it in an hour just by looking around. The story grew with each telling, as such stories always do. The fracture in the manifold became larger. Its diagnostic process became more elaborate. This embarrassment became more profound. But the core of the story remained true. Human intuition had succeeded where logic had failed. And slowly, quietly, human mechanics began receiving more job offers. Requests came from species who had never hired human workers before. The work was usually the same: systems that should work but did not, problems that diagnostics could not find, failures that made no sense. The humans fixed them, not always, not every time, but often enough that word continued to spread. Never knew that he had started something. He went back to his cargo freighters and his patched jumpsuits, fixing engines and calibrating sensors, and doing the work he had always done. He was just a mechanic. That was all he had ever wanted to be. But In remembered him, and in the cycles that followed, as she worked alongside humans and learned their strange methods, she thought often of the lesson he had taught her. Some problems could not be solved by knowing more. Some problems could only be solved by knowing differently. And in a galaxy that had long believed intelligence meant processing speed and mathematical precision, that was a revolutionary idea. The quantum fold drive of the eternal axiom hummed steadily as the ship made its way back to space. In the engine bay, the repaired manifold joint held firm. It was ugly by standards, a crude patch of human metalwork amid the crystalline perfection of the drive system. But it worked, and sometimes that was all that mattered.